Welcome to NSTA Web Seminars, where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. Today's web seminar is part of our Supporting the Implementation of NGSS series, and it is titled NARST Researchers' Perspectives on Curriculum. Our presenters this evening are Corey Buxton, Janet Carlson, and Betty Davis. My name is Sue Hokanen, and I will be moderating today's program. Jeff Lehman is also online with us this evening to provide technical support. I want to remind you to visit the NSTA Learning Center, your online portal for professional learning, and over 11,900 resources for science educators. You'll find that 4,200 of those resources are free, and you can add them to your library to access when it's convenient for you. You can organize those resources by bundling them into collections or access thousands of other collections made by NSTA and other teachers. You can join the conversation in the community forums, where you can discuss content and classroom issues with other teachers, and online advisors are available to help you find the information you are looking for. You can also use our free tools to help you organize your own professional development to meet your professional development goals, and it's all available at learningcenter.nsta.org. And with that, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenters. First, we have Janet Carlson. She is the Director for the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching at Stanford University, BSCS. Elizabeth Davis. She's a science educator and teacher educator with the University of Michigan. And Corey Buxton, Professor of Educational Theory and Practice at the University of Georgia. Welcome, everyone. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sue. This is Betsy Davis, and I would really like to extend our appreciation for all of you for joining us. We've been really looking forward to this webinar for quite some time, and we're thrilled to have it actually be here finally. The focus of tonight's webinar will be curriculum materials and the implementation of the next generation science standards. I'd like to just give a short overview of what we'll be addressing today. First, we'll provide a bit of an overview of the next generation science standards and put that in relationship to science curriculum materials. Then we'll briefly review some of the research that's related to curriculum materials as curriculum materials relate to science teaching and science learning. Third, we'll turn to reviewing some of the characteristics of effective science curriculum materials and think together about what we can look for in curriculum materials and how we can review curriculum materials. And then the final portion of this evening's webinar will be focused on ways that we can adapt existing science curriculum materials. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Betsy. So welcome, everybody, and thanks. Where we are right now, obviously, is right at the beginning. So I am going to lead us in a short discussion about how next-generation science standards relate to curriculum materials. We know that most of you are probably quite familiar with NGSS by now, but we just wanted to lay a little groundwork as we've been thinking about how NGSS and the goals of NGSS are related to our work as curriculum developers. So there's a few really important conceptual shifts in NGSS that we feel are relevant to our thinking about curriculum. So we know that NGSS really emphasizes the interconnected nature of science across content areas and disciplines, and that, of course, needs to be reflected in curriculum. We know that NGSS emphasizes student performance standards, but it's not a curriculum in and of itself. So we'll talk a little bit more about what we do mean by curriculum materials and where NGSS fits in. We're going to talk about the science concepts in NGSS being built coherently from kindergarten through high school, and again, that has major implications for curriculum. We know that NGSS focuses on a deep understanding and application of content, and one of the ways it does this is through the integration of science and engineering in the NGSS practices. So those are themes that are going to come up repeatedly through the presentation this evening. So, of course, the heart of NGSS is this idea of three-dimensional learning, the idea that science learning should be and needs to be a combination of a focus on disciplinary core ideas, like force and motion or evolution. It has to include and integrate in a very meaningful way science and engineering practices, ideas such as modeling and constructing explanations, and the idea of cross-cutting concepts, the really large sort of concepts like energy, matter, cause and effect that are really evident in all the disciplines of science. So, if NGSS is not a curriculum, then what do we mean when we're talking about curriculum materials? In this presentation, we're talking about tools that teachers and students use to support and guide their teaching and learning. So those can come in all shapes and sizes. What they have in common is that students and teachers are using them to support the learning. Now, curriculum materials can fall on a continuum from less support to more support, and it's going to be really important as we think about NGSS that curriculum materials that support NGSS are on the more supportive side. This is new ways of thinking for teachers and for students, and therefore curriculum materials that are responsive to NGSS are going to need to provide that support for teachers and for learners. So the curriculum materials can help teachers and students meet the goals of NGS, but they won't necessarily do this. If we want to have curriculum materials that do support NGSS, then we need to think about what next generation curriculum materials need to include, what they need to attend to. So three of the big things that they need to attend to are the structure and flow of the content. They need to provide recommended instructional strategies to support NGSS, and they need to have experiences, ideas for teachers and students about the suggested experiences that kids should have along the way. So some important qualities of next generation curriculum materials are that we need to really think about how much content kids can learn. If we're going to do three-dimensional teaching, then we need to not pile every bit of content knowledge in that we sometimes have had in past curriculum materials. So we need to be thoughtful about the content. We need to be thoughtful about incorporating the cross-cutting concepts, because again, this is a piece of science teaching that as teachers sometimes we haven't given as much attention to in the past as we're going to need to within NGSS. Third, we need to incorporate meaningful engagement in the science and engineering practices, because again, we've always talked about science processes, but the practices really are integrated in NGSS in a deeper way than processes or increased skills were in the past. And finally, we need to have materials that support teachers in developing a vision of NGSS and their critical role, all our critical roles as educators in supporting NGSS. So that's a really brief summary of the conversations we've been having amongst ourselves about how to think about the intersection of NGSS and curriculum. So we've got time for a couple questions if anybody wants to pose anything at this point about how NGSS relates to curriculum materials.
Okay, so now is your opportunity. And throughout the web seminar, actually, feel free at any time to type questions into the chat window, and I will gather them and bring them back to the presenter's attention. So if you have a question, now would be a great time to go ahead and type it in. And Alyssa does have a question. She's asking, have any text materials been created that align with the NGSS?
And I think probably that Betsy and Janet may be in a better position to answer that question. So if anybody wants to chime in.
So one of the things that, this is Janet, I'm looking at the questions that have something to do with other sites where there are curriculum materials to view, and have any materials been created that align with NGSS? Short answer is a modified yes. There are materials that are in the ballpark with strong alignment. There are also materials available that are stamped that they're aligned, and it's important to be a critical consumer, and we're actually going to talk a little bit more about that. At this point, I'm just going to put a plug in for the NSTA resources, and Sue can remind you of that link, because NSTA is going to be one of your first stops for checking out NGSS aligned curriculum materials. But all three of us will actually give examples later on, so I don't want to cover that twice.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janet for the next section.
Oops. Thank you, Corey. So what we're going to do now is a very, very brief overview of some research related to curriculum materials, teaching, and learning. And we're simply going to look at 3 examples and a synthesis of the research as a small jump into the pond of the massive research about the role of curriculum materials in improving teaching and learning and supporting the kind of work that the NGSS encourages us all to do in our classrooms. As Corey and Betsy and I were talking about how to think about the role of curriculum materials when we were developing the position statement for NARST that this webinar is based on, we thought it was important to identify some of our basic premises about curriculum materials. And you see the 3 important premises stated here. First, curriculum materials can be and are often a vehicle for reform in schools. Second, curriculum materials cannot be considered in isolation, but rather they have to work in conjunction with school and district structures and policies. And finally, teachers use curriculum materials as a tool for instructional decision making. And I think one of the philosophical positions that's important to all of us is to note that we don't believe in teacher-proof curriculum materials. The teacher has a very important role, just like school and district structures and policies have a very important role in having the curriculum, instruction, and assessment triangle work in favor of student learning. So before I get into the 3 examples, I want to give you a chance to respond to this question. This question is asking, how does research influence your curriculum decisions? And I don't necessarily mean your personal, it could be your school, your department, your district. And I see we've got some people active in the chat box already.
Okay, so go ahead and type into the chat, in what ways does research influence your curriculum decisions? Go ahead and type some of your ideas in so that we can read through these.
So it's exciting because we have several people that logged in that research actually plays a great deal. I want to see if we have any people on the other end of the continuum because of your particular setting. All right, so it looks like we have a lot of people that use data in their work or work in a system where data is particularly influencing instruction, and a number of you said something about how it influences curriculum, as well as your understanding that the curriculum itself should be research-based. So I think that sets everyone up well for the couple of examples that I'm going to share. 2 of these examples come from BSCS, which is a curriculum study nonprofit where I used to work and was working on this work when I was there, so that's why I have the dual affiliation on that introductory slide. The first example, however, is not from BSCS. One other explanatory note, you will see that in the summary of research, I'm going to use the phrase inquiry, and that's because all of this research was done before the NGSS was published. And of course, in newer research, as that gets published in the coming years, we're going to start to see the language of practice where we currently look articles up and they'll talk about inquiry. So this particular study was done at a middle school level, and they used some inquiry-based materials and had a comparison set of classrooms, and they found that the treatment group had significantly higher pass rates on the state standardized test in comparison with the control group. That's important because it's often thought intuitively that kids in more inquiry-oriented curriculum-based classrooms can't do as well on standardized tests because they think they haven't covered the content. And so this sort of research is one of the ways to start combating that potential argument should you encounter it. The other important piece of this work is they showed that these effects were cumulative. In other words, the more inquiry-based units students were exposed to, the more of a difference they saw in achievement on these state tests. And the results were enduring. The learning gains were still evident a year and a half after they had been exposed to those particular types of units. As I mentioned, curriculum is not teacher-proof, and the role of the teacher matters a lot in what happens with student learning. In some work done in a study at BSCS in field testing materials that I'll actually use in an example later, they found that it did matter how much kids learned mattered in how closely teachers followed the actual design of the materials. And were they using the inquiry in the way that helped promote student thinking and gave students ownership of the learning. When teachers tended to redesign the curriculum units so that there was more direct instruction, they found that student learning gains were equivalent to kids in classes with traditional materials. The next study I want to highlight is an actual experiment that was done where the program called BSCS Science and Inquiry Approach, which is a multidisciplinary high school program that covers 2 years, typically used at 9th and 10th grade, was coupled with professional development. So that's what the two photos in the middle of the slide represent. And that was compared to business as usual. In other words, whatever was going on typically in a school in terms of both professional development and curriculum. So that was the setup, and teachers were randomly assigned to one of these two conditions. The results after 2 years comparing student scores on the Washington Science Test showed that the students in the experiment were scored significantly higher, statistically significantly higher on that. And then when we looked at the difference in the teaching, there was also a statistically significant difference in what the state was measuring as standards-based teaching. So in summary, not just from those 3 examples, but across the body of research about curriculum, these are some key points. That we cannot just have curriculum materials that are inquiry-oriented. We have to have instruction that supports an inquiry orientation or investigation-based, or in our new language, practice-based approach to learning science. Professional development can be key in improving the use of that inquiry-based or practice-based approach to teaching, and that there are some very key characteristics that do distinguish the nature of high-quality investigation-based curriculum and instruction. And that's one of the things we will do next in the webinar after we give you a chance to see if you have any questions.
Okay, again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat now. Ted's been doing an excellent job. Thank you, Ted, very much for addressing questions specific to the NGSS. Karen brings up a question earlier on regarding publishers experiencing issues with incorporating the exact language of the DCIs. Since the DCIs are taken directly from the framework and are copyrighted, I don't know if this is something that you want to address now or if you want to wait and save this one for later. And then we can continue to look within the chat window too.
Sue, you weren't asking me to respond to that question, were you? Was that directed at Ted?
Anyone can take it. I don't think Ted's answered Karen's question yet. He's been answering questions more specific to the NGSS Ed standards. and this question deals more with curriculum and the incorporation of the language into that curriculum, and it sounds as if she's, you know, asking if perhaps if there's any concerns because of the copyright issues on the framework, if there's anything you're aware of with that.
I can tell you from my experience at BSCS, where we worked with publishers and we did, we addressed first generation science standards and now the next generation. It was never a copyright issue, which we were very strict about following, to excerpt pieces from standards and reference them. So, yeah, and then Ted just popped up in the chat box that copyright of standards is not a problem.
Very good. I'm not seeing any other questions right now. As you have questions, again, please feel free to type them into the chat and I will continue to gather them. If Ted doesn't answer them or one of the other presenters doesn't answer them before I get a chance to say them. So I think we're good to go.
Great. Then I'm going to pass this off to Betsy.
Thanks, Janet. I just saw a question pop up about, are we going to talk about how to design curriculum? And that's a perfect question because I was just going to remind you sort of what we're focusing on this evening. We're about to turn to thinking together about what we can look for in effective science curriculum materials. And then we'll focus most of our attention toward the end of the session on adapting existing curriculum rather than designing from scratch. And we'll say a little bit about why we're making that choice as well. So with that, we'll turn to thinking about characteristics of effective curriculum materials. And I wanted to just give you an opportunity to give some input, and this is going to be our chance to play with the poll tool that Sue will explain in just a moment. The question here is, what do you think is most important when thinking about effective science curriculum materials? And we've put together 4 choices here. First, materials that are coherent, rigorous, and focused on big ideas. Second, materials that provide and support opportunities for student sense-making and use of scientific and engineering practices. Third, materials that support teacher learning as well as student learning. And fourth, materials that engage students in activities that connect to their experiences. So I'd like to ask Sue to just explain how folks can use the poll tool, and then we'll see how the results look.
Okay, thank you. If you weren't here for our earlier training, you go underneath your name at the very top. You should see 4 boxes going across: a smiley face, a profile, and a hand, and then next to that the letter A. If you mouse over that letter A, you should get a drop-down menu, and it should allow you to check A, B, C, or D. And we will leave the polls open for a little bit, but I encourage you to vote early, vote often, get your voice heard, and I will be able to publish these for you when you are ready. And they're slowly trickling in. Again, I encourage you to vote. We're up to about 11 of you. There we go. Numbers are increasing. And again, it's underneath the letter A. There's a drop-down menu. Select A, B, C, or D. Looks like a lot of you guys have voted. A couple holdouts still. If you're having a difficult time voting using the polling tool because you're on a mobile device or otherwise, then you can, of course, type your response into the chat. It just makes it cleaner that we have all of our data in one spot, and I can actually generate a graph for us to look at using that information. So it looks like we're doing pretty good. It looks as if they're still coming in a little bit slow, so maybe I'll give you about 10 more seconds, and those might be teacher seconds, so you might want to hurry up. Okay, about 5 more seconds, and it looks like we've stopped. So I'm going to go ahead and lock responses, and then we're going to go ahead and publish this to the board so we can see. There you go.
Okay, fantastic. This is really interesting. So It looks like we had a preponderance of folks who think that choice B is particularly important, that materials should provide and support opportunities for student sense-making and use of scientific practices. But we also had responses supporting all of the different options, and in fact, our stance is that all of these are incredibly important as we think about effective science curriculum materials. And so we'll be returning to these ideas as we continue through the presentation this evening. So just to put a little bit more of a finer point on some of these ideas, thinking about what we should look for in what we are calling next generation science curriculum materials. First of all, we would argue that these materials should be research-based in their design and their development. So they need to be coherent, they need to be focused on a big idea, they need to be rigorous, and they need to honestly have been field tested and in real teachers' classrooms with real students, and then revised based on those field test results. Part of that process of being research-based in their design and development entails attending to how people learn and having a really carefully planned learning sequence that supports that coherent flow. A second piece, of course, is being well aligned with the framework and the standards. So really thinking about, for example, a lot of what Corey was introducing towards the beginning of the presentation today, really emphasizing, for example, that integration of the disciplinary core ideas, the scientific and engineering practices, and the cross-cutting concepts as one example of what we mean by aligned. A third piece is really to be able to meet the needs of teachers. As Corey mentioned earlier, this is all new. It's new to all of us. And so we really need to be looking for science curriculum materials that are supporting teachers in being able to do this work, because it's new and it's hard, and we need to be really thinking about how we support everybody as we engage in that. Which, of course, the flip side of that is being able to address the full range of all students' learning needs. So that means carefully scaffolding kids' opportunities to learn and really thinking about all kids and making sure that the curriculum materials are really supporting the needs of every kid in the classroom, not just the ones who might learn most easily or most quickly. Another piece that we worry about a lot is making sure that these materials are coordinated with formative and summative assessments, including whatever high-stakes tests are in place. And then a final piece, because we are thinking next generation, is being able to account for what we're calling a non-print paradigm. So in other words, taking advantage of the technological advances that we have. So with that, I'm going to turn it over next to Janet as we move from thinking about what we should look for in science curriculum materials to how we can look at them.
Thanks, Betsy. And at this point, I want to capture phrases in the chat box about what you think it means to be a critical consumer of curriculum materials. So if you just take a second and put a phrase in that chat box, we can see the way that people are thinking about being a consumer of the kind of curriculum materials that Betsy just described.
Okay, so let's take this opportunity to go ahead and type into the chat box what does it mean to you, the phrase critical consumer of curriculum materials. What does that phrase mean to you? We've got some good ones coming in already. Research-based with field testing, able to discern the value of curriculum to the learner, looking for alignment with NGSS. Some really good ones in here.
Yeah, this is very nice.
I like reading between the lines and stickers for the actual threads. That's a good one.
Yeah, and not reinventing the wheel. You're going to see a couple of examples of that approach as we move toward the end of the webinar. and that looking for all three dimensions is going to be one of the more challenging pieces to find right away. It's going to take a little bit of time for curriculum developers to get there. All right, thank you. I'm going to move to the next slide and probably frustrate most of you because I'm going to just whet your appetites by exposing you to two rigorous processes for choosing and analyzing curriculum materials. One of these was already mentioned by a participant who was aware of EQUIP. And the other process, analyzing instructional materials, or AIM, is available through BSCS or WestEd. I just put the two different URLs up here, the one for Project 2061 and BSCS. And I'm going to do just one slide on each of these processes, but I will acknowledge I'm not remotely doing justice to either process. We would take a webinar for each one of these to go into them in depth. The main point we wanted to make by stepping into this how do we be critical consumers part of our webinar is that if you're really going to take NGS seriously and the implementation of it through curriculum materials to heart, you have to take the time to choose the materials carefully. In the AIM process, it has two major components. The first piece is a paper screen. Let me get my pointer, which starts by finding the short list of curriculum materials that you're going to look at, or the long list. You work through several categories of criteria. The science content, which would be the way you would check for your alignment with standards, the way that students are working, what the kind of assessment tools are, and the support for teachers. In other words, how do the programs help the teachers do their work? There's a whole process for gathering evidence, analyzing that evidence and using a rubric, and then scoring it and pulling those results together. The second phase, which I don't have represented, is not the paper screen, but it's actually testing it in the classroom. And there was a comment from somebody that said something about seeing how they work with the kids. Yeah, evaluate materials based on how materials presented to students was one way, and I think there was a second way it was said. But the best way to do that, and it's rarely done, is to actually do a pilot test in your district before you make a big purchasing decision. And that's the second step of the AIM process. EQUIP, when Project 21 runs their workshops, teams from schools, districts, or informal learning centers come together. They spend 2 days, and they work on the coherence of the science content that they're going to teach. They look for how to increase students' knowledge of conceptual development and the understanding of common difficulties students have, and then they look at the alignment of curriculum instruction to that work. So again, it's another complex way to think about the role of curriculum because there's a student lens, there's a teacher lens, there's thinking about content, there's thinking about instruction. And I do know I have not even scratched the surface of either of those. This was mostly designed to give you an awareness of the two rigorous processes. So once again, we'll return to the chat box where you guys are putting some great ideas, and you may have noticed there was even a comment asking if there's a process for being able to copy out of the chat room, and that there certainly is. So I want to see if you have any questions about ways to review curriculum materials in terms of determining if they reflect NGSS and how they could be adapted. And this is as much a forward-looking opportunity for questions to move us into our next topic on the webinar.
Okay, so again, now's your opportunity to ask your questions. Go ahead and type those into the chat box. Looks like a couple of you may be typing, so we'll pause for just a second. Okay, and then Cynthia is asking if there's tools being used now, and there will be a rubric. There must be a rubric for reviewing curriculum, Ms. Whitney. So perhaps both of those questions can be answered in tandem.
So both of those processes that I referenced on the previous slides do include rubrics, and I would count the rubrics among tools. The challenge is in order to use either of those processes, you need to get the training from Project 2061, BSCS, or as I mentioned, WestEd also does work with the AIM process.
And then there is one question. Teresa asked if it is imperative to move away from domain-specific middle schools if we are building and making connections. And I think what she's referencing there is I know a lot of middle schools teach earth science 6th grade, life science 7th grade, and then 8th grade maybe your physical sciences. And if Teresa, if I'm misunderstanding your question, please retype more information in the chat. But do you feel that it's imperative that we move away from that model and move into a more cross-cutting concept model to address the NGSS?
I've heard arguments both ways. My personal preference, which is not a research-based preference, is that I think moving away from the discipline specific in middle school can make it easier to develop a stronger approach to the cross-cutting themes that sets you up for high school in a way that lets the kids dig deeper into the individual disciplines. But if other people want to comment and build on that idea, I welcome you to do so in the chat box. There's another question about, does this typically happen at the district level? I'm not 100% sure what it is, but if it's checking for alignment with standards, publishers often publish alignments. I think it is always worth checking that again at the district level. If the question was about the analysis of curriculum materials, that should be done at the district or school level, depending where curriculum decisions are made.
Karen's posted a response that she agrees, but decision can be made at district or state level. Middle school and high school model course pathways. I'm not sure if that clarifies anything there, but I don't see any other questions, so perhaps we should move forward. And then again, just continue to type questions in, and I'll try to gather as you're moving forward. Thank you.
And I'm going to turn it over to Betsy now.
Okay. Terrific. So we'll kind of check in again with where we are. And we're going to turn now to thinking together about how we can adapt existing curriculum materials. And as we begin this, I'd like to start again with gathering some input from you all. And we're going to get to use the clip art this time. And what I'd like for you to do is to think about the statements that are listed here and think about whether you agree. And if you agree, you can use a green check. And if you disagree, you can use a red X. And someone's already jumped ahead and done so. That's fine. So think about each of these statements. And just, if you have a strong opinion, go ahead and enter that into some of the boxes. We'll just take a couple moments to do that.
Okay, and if you joined us later, your clip art, I did give you back your clip art tools. Just go to the bottom box. Looks like a mountain with the sun coming over the top of it. Click on it, open it, and you can find the green check mark and the red X inside of there, and then you can place them in the appropriate spot. Also, you can move that clip art. If you grab that top bar on the very top, you can actually slide it down so it moves out of the way of the slide if you find that it's in the way, or you can move it up. But you can just move it so that it's not in the way of the graphic on this slide. And just let me know when you're ready, and I will pause their screen marking tools.
I think we can probably pause at this point, Sue. It looks like we are generating some consensus anyway, some close to consensus. So why don't we go ahead and pause that?
They are paused.
Right. Thank you. So it's very interesting to see this preponderance of red X's on a couple of these statements, a little bit more mixed on choice C, quite a few people who agree with none of the statements. We would argue that each of these statements, in a way, is problematic. And so I wanted to just say a couple of things about these. So the first statement, about expert teachers. So really we know that even expert teachers use curriculum materials, and many teachers in fact are really expert at using existing curriculum materials with their specific students. So the sort of against curriculum materials that, oh, I can't use them because they don't fit my students. Actually, some teachers are really phenomenally skilled at using those existing curriculum materials and marrying them with their own students. Similarly, a lot of us feel as though if our district adopts curriculum materials that they expect that we will follow the program exactly as it's written. But really we know that teachers always are making adaptations. Small tweaks that really can refine something in their classroom. And so one of our goals today actually is to help with that refinement process. The third statement here had a little bit more scatter in terms of how people were responding. And I guess that the concern for us with regard to the idea of picking and choosing is if you have a set of curriculum materials that were developed really purposefully and that meet those characteristics that we were describing before, picking and choosing can actually have the adverse effect of reducing the coherence and the rigor of a set of curriculum materials. Or another example would be the materials might actually integrate disciplinary core ideas and science or engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts, and picking and choosing you might accidentally reduce some of that alignment with the NGSS. So there are ways in which picking and choosing can be a little bit problematic depending on what the materials are that you have. So we'll move on and think about, so we know that teachers do all of these things. Teachers do create their own lessons, units, and curriculum materials. Teachers do use materials that are chosen by others, largely at the district level. And teachers are critical consumers of curriculum materials as they review, select, and adapt materials. So all of these things happen, and so the question that we want to turn to is how we can make good decisions. So we'll turn now to focusing on making good decisions about adapting curriculum materials. As a tool, again, as Janet was saying, thinking about tools, about curriculum materials as being tools or blueprints for how we can design instruction. So again, this is a reminder that we talked about these characteristics before, that when we're adapting materials, we can think about the most effective science curriculum materials as having these features: being coherent, rigorous, focused on big ideas, providing and supporting opportunities for kids' sense-making and their use of scientific and engineering practices, that they support teacher learning as well as student learning, and they engage kids in activities that connect to their experiences. So with those in mind, I want you just to try and keep those characteristics in mind as we move forward. And what we'd like to do now is turn to 3 examples of how we, each of the presenters, have seen curriculum materials adapted for classrooms to begin to meet the expectations of the next-gen science standards. So Janet will start us off thinking about a focus on conceptual coherence and building on big ideas. I'll go next and I'll talk about ways in which we've adapted materials to incorporate practices and to support teachers' learning as well. And then Corey will wrap us up with thinking about adapting for local contexts and making science more accessible for English learners. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janet.
Thank you, Betsy. So I'm going to start with an end product and then look at 2 of the steps that can get curriculum to this kind of end product. In this case, we're looking at 2 pages from a student book that is from that same program I mentioned before, BSc of Science and Inquiry Approach. This is from the Level 1 book, which is typically used in 9th grade. And if you look where, let's see, where my pointer is here, circling the middle of page 319, these are the major concepts for this particular chapter. There's 2 that have to do with biology science content, and then 1 that has to do with scientific communication. So this is the beginning of seeing how we can weave together the 3 different dimensions of NGSS. Then if you start up here, kind of in the center, slightly to the left, this is where the chapter begins, and there's a brief summary of the key idea from that lesson. There's a question that links it to the next lesson. Now you start to see a little bit more elaboration on key ideas as we move into the explore phase. Another linking question. The heart of the explanation that the student is to develop right here about converting sunlight into sugar is defined with 2 key ideas, which is then linked to a second explain about how cellular activities are powered. When the students move through to their elaborate lesson, they're looking at how photosynthesis works specifically and converts the sun's energy. And then there's a second key idea on biosynthesis and breakdown reactions, which then links them into their evaluate activity, where they're responsible for tracing a carbon atom and the movement of the atom, as well as what happens to the energy through an organism. And this is made explicit to the students through this graphic in their book. And that gives an idea of all 3, the coherence, how things connect, the rigor, what's the content that we're going to learn, and then the focus. We're staying focused on these major concepts by going through this sequence of lessons. So that's an end product. It's all pretty. It's got the pictures. But how did it get there? And how could you understand it if you were either analyzing or adapting materials? When we have done professional development with teachers to analyze curriculum materials, one of the places we start is this kind of big idea chart. You'll see in the first column under investigation, so just the title of an investigation. This is 3 out of 5 or 6 from a particular chapter in a high school biology book. The teacher identifies the big idea or concept for each investigation. The teacher also goes through the lesson and says, what is it that kids are doing to help them learn the concept? So this is the teacher building an understanding of the coherence, the focus, and the rigor in a particular chapter. At this point, once this idea chart is finished with an established instructional sequence, that could be a chapter, it could be a unit, varies depending what kind of curriculum you're looking at, then you can say, well, what's not here that we want here? Do we want something that helps use our outdoors when we're looking at the ecology of our neighborhood? And we don't think that's deep enough in this particular unit. So where are we going to insert that? They've got video images here, but we think those videos could be enhanced if we had students collect photos when they go out for a hike. Whatever. There's an opportunity, once you know what is there and how it connects, to move to a personalization step. And that can be done by first constructing a conceptual flow graphic where the overarching concept is identified, the big ideas for each activity are noted, and then the connections, strong, weak, or none, which will look like this after a teacher has studied. In this case, it's a unit that's comprised of 2 chapters. There's this one main idea for the unit. The teacher saw very strong links between that main idea and the key idea for each chapter. And then what they noted down here are the individual activities. And the white tags on each of the pink stickies are actually the style of activity. It's what are the students doing? Are they collecting data? Are they communicating data? These are key to practices of science. And then you'll see the various arrows to indicate the strength of the connection, the strong, the medium, and the weak. So this process helps both curriculum developers and curriculum users develop coherent, focused, and rigorous curriculum materials. So Betsy, I'm going to turn it over. Oops. I think that's not right. I think we are going to do a poll before I turn it over to Betsy. So if you think about trying to help people understand conceptual coherence in a curriculum that they're using, which of these ideas might be helpful? Working with a team of teachers to identify key ideas in a major unit of study, mapping the disciplinary core ideas onto units of study to see what happens where, identifying times during the year when particular things are taught, and looking for coherence in that trajectory, or creating conceptual flow graphics for each unit in the course. So Sue will lead us back through the directions for taking a poll, and we'll see where your ideas land.
Okay, again, underneath your name at the very top, you see 4 little boxes. The far left is a smiley face, far right is the letter A. If you mouse over and click on that letter A, a drop-down menu should appear, and from that you will select A, B, C, or D to define what could you do to understand the conceptual coherence in your curriculum. Go ahead and select the answer that best represents your response. And if you're not able to respond because you're on a mobile device or for any other reason, then please type your response into the chat area. But if you do have access to the polling tool, please use that first. And again, I'm going to scroll through and see how we're doing. Looks like we've got a lot of responses in. Just a couple of you guys that we're waiting for. And if you want to let me know if you want them locked. What do you think, Janet? Should we go ahead and lock this and or let them go for just another?
A couple still popping in.
Okay.
All right.
Go ahead.
All right. So, Sue, have you locked it?
I just locked it, and I'm going to publish them right now. Sorry. I'm trying to figure out where to put it so you can see it.
Sorry, too many words on there. Maybe that lower right-hand corner. There you go.
How about right there? Is that good?
All right. Very good. So your 5-minute crash course in conceptual flow graphics obviously influenced you, although if you looked over in the chat box, you noticed folks saw value in all of these, and they're actually fairly interrelated. And what we wanted to do with this set of ideas, the ABCD that are listed there, is give you an idea that there's a couple different ways you can get into this kind of work, and some are more time-consuming than others, and sometimes you have to make decisions based on how much time is available, and then look at a trajectory over time of what professional development time is available over a school year, summer, or sequence of those to maybe build over time. Like if you are very, very limited on time, maybe step A is the only thing you can do, is just get a team of teachers focused in on thinking in terms of key ideas. And then maybe the next step is looking at those key ideas and mapping them against the DCIs. If you have more time or you already have a system where you meet regularly in professional learning communities, then you could probably jump to something like D that really does take multiple days to get through a unit. So let's see, and I see that Ted posted, or maybe he's reposting a question about how do conceptual flow graphics relate to storylines provided in NGSS. I would say that conceptual flow graphics are almost synonymous with the concept of storylines. The sort of difference for me is NGSS is saying, here's a potential storyline. A conceptual flow graphic, if you're analyzing current curriculum materials, is a representation of the storyline that exists or doesn't exist in that existing material. So they could be absolutely synonymous, but they it depends on the kind of materials. All right, I'm sorry, I'm pausing to check the chat box to see if we've captured key ideas before I pass the microphone back to Betsy. All right, I think we're good. So Betsy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Janet. So we'll turn to our second example now. And this example will focus on ways in which we worked on enhancing the science practices within a unit and also providing some support for teacher learning. And this example is a little bit different than what Janet was describing in that in this example, we were working with existing curriculum materials, and we as a group of researchers were working on refining the curriculum materials in light of the NGSS vision. So this is a little bit different, but I think also pretty straightforward for teachers to do themselves as well. So in this case, we were working with upper elementary units focused on ecosystems and electric circuits that were from the STC series developed by the Smithsonian. So these are really high quality, kit-based inquiry in their terminology oriented science curriculum materials. So very high quality. But they were developed, as many of us are dealing with right now, they were developed prior to the NGSS release, and so prior to really the strong emphasis on integrating scientific practice and science content. And so that was part of what we were trying to accomplish with the adaptations that we were engaging in. So as we reviewed the curriculum materials ourselves, we first analyzed the materials to identify what were the existing opportunities where students were being engaged in scientific practices, and we were really only, in this particular project, only focusing on the science practices. Where were there opportunities where they were being engaged in science practices or could be? And then we worked to add opportunities for more robust engagement in the practices. So we added opportunities for justifying predictions and making and recording scientific observations to support investigations. We worked on incorporating opportunities for supporting claims with evidence and designing investigations. And then at the same time, we were adding supports for teachers that were focused on these adaptations that we were making. So for example, in thinking about how we were trying to enhance the supports for science practices, we added suggestions for teachers in sort of the sidebar of the print materials, suggesting opportunities for teachers to ask students to actually justify their predictions or to make explanations. In other words, support claims with evidence and reasoning, and make and record high quality observations. But at the same time, we were also infusing supports for the teachers in actually being able to do this work. So, for example, let's see here. We added a set of rubrics and examples that provides examples of student work and sample teacher comments that a teacher could write on that student work that made visible the characteristics of the science practices that we were emphasizing in the materials. We added reminders about where science practices could be incorporated and why they were important. We added some narratives that described how teachers that we had previously observed teaching these units and worked with on the ways in which they were engaging with the materials. We added narratives that described some of the most productive adaptations that those teachers had made to the curriculum materials that could further strengthen the lesson plans. We gave suggestions about sentence starters that could be used for engaging kids in the science practices. We gave some background information about the different science practices. And one that I wanted to mention as well, because it connects to Janet's example, and Ted's question about it, we also added content storylines that would highlight the big ideas and what the connections were between the lessons. So I'd like to turn to an opportunity for some more input. And here we're just going to use the green checks if you can. And just think together about what you could do to increase your students' opportunities for science practices integrated with disciplinary core ideas or science content. What are some of the ways in which you can adapt curriculum materials in your own classroom? And just read through these opportunities, these possibilities. And if you can try and keep your check off of the words and on the left side, that'll let other people read the options as well. We'll just take a few minutes for this.
Okay, and again, I've given you your whiteboard tools, so if you can go down to the very bottom of them, it looks like a mountain with the sun or a moon coming up over the top. Look for the green check, and then again, try to keep them off the words if you can, and try to keep them to the default size also, so that we can get them all up on the screen and everyone can be seen. And if for some reason you do not have access to the clip art, which I know that happens to me sometimes on my Mac, you can also use the, there's a pencil tool. It's the third tool down. You can actually even select green ink and put a check mark that way if you'd like. Just again, try to keep them to that about the same size so that we can get everybody on the page.
All right, so we can probably close it. It looks like, oh, there's still a couple coming in, but I think we're pretty good.
Okay, their tools are paused.
All righty. So this is great. This is exactly how I feel, is that really each of these is a great way to for us to adapt existing curriculum materials to try to increase kids' meaningful opportunities to integrate those disciplinary core ideas and the science practices. And this didn't incorporate the focus on the cross-cutting concepts, but obviously that's a really key piece as well. I wanted, before we move on, I wanted to just, there were a couple questions on here that I thought we should maybe address. So somebody asked, what are sentence stems and talk moves? They're actually quite similar, except usually we talk about sentence stems when we're using written work, and talk moves is what teachers and kids can say. So in my own classroom, I might have a talk move where I'm very regularly asking kids to give me evidence. Oh, what's your evidence for that claim that you're making? I'm using some of that language from the next generation science standards and emphasizing the importance of justifying your claims rather than thinking that a claim is just something that you just would guess at. You know, Carla Zembal-Saul and Kate McNeil have really a really nice book together, and then Kate McNeil with Joe Krajcik has another really nice book in which they outline some very nice talk moves and sentence starters actually for supporting explanation and argumentation in particular. So I'll try and get that added into the chat box as a reference as well. I don't know if there were other questions that needed addressing, so I think we'll go ahead and I'll pass the baton on to Corey.
Okay, thanks, Betsy. I'm going to give you one more example here of work from a project that I've been engaged in for the past few years, where we've been thinking and working with teachers about making curricular adaptations. And we were really focused on classroom context and specifically on working with English language learners, but a lot of the lessons and the things we came up with really, I think, have a broader point to make about how to guide teachers in making curricular adaptations. So the LESL project, which stands for Language-Rich Inquiry Science with English Language Learners, is a project that aims to support both the development of science investigation practices and academic language practices in middle schools with large numbers of second language learners. And we really wanted to focus on the context, and for us that included language, culture, geography, and really a number of other contextual features, and how that context informs the enacted curriculum, or how a curriculum actually plays out in the classroom in a real space in real time. And we wanted to work with teachers to adapt their curriculum, but also to adapt their practices. And we wanted to do this by providing a range of professional learning opportunities that we thought might influence curricular adaptation, while also making sure that we were paying attention to the qualities of effective curriculum materials that we've been talking about this evening. So we didn't want to do anything that would damage coherence or rigor or opportunities for students' sense-making, as we were working with teachers to make adaptations based on content and context. So we created a professional learning framework with 5 components, and maybe a little hard to read, but we ran a Teacher Professional Learning Institute and then a Student Summer Academy where the teachers would bring some of their students, nominate their students, and we would work with them in kind of a low-stakes space. And then we also ran grand rounds classroom observations during the school year. We ran a series of bilingual family workshops for teachers, kids, and parents during the school year. And we ran a series of teacher workshops where the teachers looked at student writing as a way to get insight into their students' sense-making. And as we were doing this, we wanted to very intentionally study teachers' engagement in that professional learning. In other words, not all teachers participated in all aspects of the professional learning, and certainly not all teachers engaged in the same way while they were participating. And then we wanted to look at their enactment of practices, what they did with the work that we were doing together in the workshops. And what we found, which certainly is related to this idea of adapting curriculum materials, is that teachers who were more fully engaged in a wider variety of the professional learning contexts ended up making different and more effective curricular adaptations than teachers who were engaged in a narrower selection of the professional learning. So which professional learning contexts teachers chose to engage in also influenced how they thought about and how they acted on curricular adaptation. So I'll give you just a few examples of this. So here come talk moves again. So teachers who participated with us in the Student Summer Academy started to realize that they needed some supports for helping their students use the academic language of science in ways that helped them explain their evolving thinking of the practices. So the teachers, along with our research team, came up with a series of talk moves that teachers could then take back to the classroom during the school year to scaffold that language that would help students understand how do you communicate cause and effect reasoning, how do you communicate using argument and evidence. So that's one example, and that came out of a particular professional learning context. Teachers who participated more with us in our Looking at Student Writing workshops came up with some different adaptations. They got very interested in creating tools to scaffold students' writing during investigations, again, to simultaneously support students' language development and their developing thinking about the practices. So the sort of table on the right that is probably impossible for you to read is a teacher-generated scaffold for coordinating hypothesis, observation, and evidence. And then there's 2 sets of lines down below. The top one is asking kids to talk with a partner and then to use everyday language to explain their thinking about hypothesis, observation, and evidence in the context of an activity. And then the second set of lines is to use scientific language to explain your thinking, and teachers would give a word bank and other scaffolds, some talk moves, some sentence stems to help the students scaffold a more academic language approach. So that's another adaptation. And then the third example is for teachers who participated with us more in our family workshops. They started thinking a lot about multiple models, multiple representations to express concepts while also reducing the language load. teachers in these workshops, which were done bilingually, often found themselves in the role of second language learners, engaging with their students and their students' families in science investigations. And they were the ones that said, whoa, I need some different models, I need multiple ways of thinking about this if the language is going over my head because it's a language that I don't fully comprehend. So again, teachers took that idea of building more models, lots of different types of models, to simultaneously highlight practices while reducing language load. So I guess my take-home lesson from this set of examples is that adaptations can really strengthen aspects of effective curriculum materials, but again, they don't necessarily do so. So not every adaptation is going to be helpful. So when you're working either with yourself in your classroom or working with other teachers to think about curricular adaptations, you want to keep going back, I think, to the touchstones, some of the core ideas we've talked about tonight, that you need to think about the coherence, the rigor, student sense-making, and support for teacher learning as well as student learning. And as you're building your adaptations, keep going back to, are these adaptations strengthening for my students or weakening these core features of effective curriculum materials? So now I would like to hear from you a little bit about any contextual features. What are some aspects of your classroom context that you think do influence your adaptation, your curricular adaptation decisions, or you know that maybe you should be doing more to address it, but you're not quite sure what to do? So type any thoughts you have, please, in the chat box.
Okay, again, this is your time to be heard. Go ahead and type in your context and your curriculum. So using the chat box, identify any specific characteristics about your classroom that influence your curricular adaptation decisions. Excellent. We're starting to get a couple in already.
So Catherine says English language learners. That is something I know about, so we can certainly talk, and I can point you towards some resources on that one. Another one, consistently large class sizes and small working spaces or not enough lab space. That's one that I certainly felt as a classroom teacher. Doing more with writing is one that we work on all the time. It's very tough to get middle school students to do writing in science, as many of you probably know. This isn't writing class, Dr. Buxton, why we gotta write? But it's critical if you want students to really develop the language of science. They need practice speaking, they need practice writing, and that practice needs to be scaffolded in very intentional ways. Time, yes, time constraints, always tough. Lack of lab materials. Elementary grades. So yeah, there are certainly, these are all big challenges. None of them have magic solutions, but there is a fair amount of work out there now on many of these topics to help keep us pointed in the right direction. And of course, not much of it is focused directly on next generation science standards, so there's sort of this need now to think about adapting the materials we already have to align better with NGSS. So this is work that many of us are going to be involved in for years to come, I suspect. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Janet, who's going to start to get us wrapped up.
Thanks, Coy. All right. To begin to close the webinar, before we move to the informal Q&A section, we wanted to leave you with some questions rather than some answers. And you'll notice as we went through the examples, we focused on two big categories: adopting or choosing or buying curriculum materials, and adapting and designing curriculum materials. So we've divided our summary questions into those two categories. So we think that when you're considering adopting curriculum materials, there are two big questions that can guide that decision. And one is to find out in what ways the instructional strategies and structure and flow of the curriculum materials are conducive to the goals of the NGSS and its three-dimensional learning framework. That three-dimensional learning framework is the most complex aspect that you're going to find, you'll be challenged to find good examples of. We also think you need to look carefully at the support the materials provide for both teachers and students in meeting the goals of the NGSS. Knowing that it's going to be a while before we can find high quality, strong materials that are fully aligned with NGSS, we think that many more of you are going to be in the role of adapting and designing curriculum materials. And so we have this question for you to keep in mind as you work on those endeavors. In what ways are the key aspects of effective curriculum materials, including coherence, rigor, a focus on student sense-making, and students using the practices of science, as well as support for teacher learning, strengthened or weakened by how you're adapting and designing curriculum materials? I want to pause here and note there was a comment much earlier in the chat box about the role of thinking about developing skills before introducing content, I think was the nature of it. The chat box has gotten so long I've lost a couple of the details. And I wanted to point out that with the change in the NGSS in comparison to previous generations of standards, what we're looking at instead of the sort of things we used to think of as the skills of science and those practices of inquiry is this blended model where the practices of science are in support of sense-making. And if you teach the skills independent of content, you have nothing to make sense about. So the next generation of science standards is really going to push all of our practice in trying to think about how do I have a content-rich environment and help kids develop practices of science in a way that they make sense of both. And there may be times when we pause and we teach a skill, but we need to come back and link it right into that DCI or cross-cutting concept. So finally, as you're choosing new materials or you're adapting existing ones, here are those key characteristics that you'll find in the NARST position statement and that we've used to formulate the conversation in this webinar. That next generation of science curriculum materials needs to be research-based in both its design and its development, well aligned with the framework and standards, able to meet the needs of teachers, address the full range of student learning needs, be coordinated with formative and summative assessments, and one we did not spend time talking about today is it needs to be able to account for a non-print paradigm. And by that we mean the world of the textbook is essentially over. Students don't learn in a linear fashion. They're used to an online world. They're used to thinking in terms of connections that go out and branch. And when you're in a print paradigm, whether it's something in print or electronic, it means you're thinking linearly. And as we think about the next generation of curriculum materials, we've got to get out of that paradigm. So with that summary, we want to pause, that's all three of us, Betsy, Corey, and myself, and thank NARST, our professional organization, which was headed by Sharon Lynch and Lynn Bryan at the time this position statement work was launched. Our friends at NSTA, Flavio did a lot of upfront work laying the details in place for our webinar. Stephanie got us all trained. Sue's been a great moderator today. I think Jeff has taken care of all the technical problems because I'm certainly not aware of any. And we didn't know that Ted Willard would be joining us, and he has been absolutely instrumental in that chat box, which we are very thankful for. We're also thankful to all the curriculum developers, teachers, and researchers that we've worked with over the years and have contributed to both our individual thinking and the greater body of work. And thank you to all of you. You've been great participating in all the polls and the chats, and I think that's added a lot of life to the webinar. So Sue, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Sue, we're not hearing you.
Sorry, thank you very much. And with that, let's give a round of applause to our presenters this evening. And we can find the applause underneath the smiley face that's underneath our name. not the hand. I know it looks like that would applaud, but the hand is actually you're raising your hand. Underneath the smiley face, there is an applause button. If you want to click on that, let's give a round of applause to our presenters for this evening. We had Janet, Betsy, and Corey, and we also had Ted Willard, who worked very hard for us behind the scenes. So a round of applause for all of our presenters this evening. Thank you very much. And thank you to NARST for sponsoring today's program. And thank you to the administration of NSTA for their support of web seminars. And I want to remind you that you can find resources related to today's presentation by going to the web seminar collection in the NSTA Learning Center, which will include the archive to the web seminar and the presentation slides. The collection may also include journal articles and lesson plans, interactive content modules called Science Objects and SciPacks, and links to helpful websites and multimedia. I'm going to put a link directly into the chat area on the collection. So give me just a second to get that copied and pasted in there for you. Okay, it should be there now. And you will also, everyone who's registered for the program will also receive an email within the next day or so with a link to access the archive and the collection. When I say archive, I mean an archive of this presentation. You can listen to it again if there's parts of it you need to hear again to better understand it. So again, the link for the collection is in the chat window. Go ahead and click on that. And then I also want to remind you that we have some upcoming web seminars. On February 10th, we have a follow-up to this one, supporting the implementation of NGSS, NARST Researchers' Perspectives on Equity. On February 18th, we have Teaching NGSS in the Elementary School, where we will be discussing the 5th grade. However, I have found that these apply to grade bands on either side of the grade that they are discussing, so it's worthwhile for other teachers other than 5th grade to participate in also. And then February 24th, we are using the Learning Center as your e-textbook with pre-service teachers. You can register for these upcoming programs by visiting learningcenter.nsta.org/webseminars, and I'm actually going to post a link for that also into the chat so that you can go ahead and bookmark that and go back to it when you're done with your survey this evening. And with that, I want to thank everyone again for your participation. We look forward to seeing you again on another NSTA web seminar soon.